Stage 14 had a series of medium-ish climbs throughout the day, but with Monte Zoncolan looming at the end, they felt about as threatening as the roadside balloons, which isn't to say entirely innocuous, right, Matteo? Behind Age Desert's Matteo Monteguti and the rest of the break, and with only occasional discussion in the Italian style, the workload was shared by a number of top teams, Bahrain Merida, Sky, but primarily race leaders Mitchelton Scott. Still, as Dimension Data's Ben King will attest, the chasing tempo was hardly blistering early on, and the gap went as high as 6 minutes and 20 seconds before the stiff, twisting Passo Duron climb reduced the break to 5 and the gap to 3:40, all while providing Sam Bennett the opportunity to demonstrate his time as Peter Sagan's teammate has not been wasted. Pace remained high enough for the occasional hair-raising moment on the descent, and the increased effort in the break prompted UAE Emirates' Valerio Conti to shed his newsprint base layer. As Mitchelton Scott brought the gap down to nearly a minute, the now depapered Conti split the escape with an attack at 21.7k to go, and managed to more or less hold that gap over the now properly charging peloton. As the pack regrouped post-descent, Bahrain and Astana swarmed past Mitchelton to set pace, provoking some surprising separation within the bunch and prompting former Zoncolan winner Igor Anton of Dimension Data to make an attack. But the unrelenting gradient of Zoncolan does not lend itself to early moves, and even as Anton reeled in Conti 2k later, a strong but diminishing peloton was never far out of sight. As Sky's Wout Poels took an abnormally small portion of energy food and began to drive the pace, there was a certain air of familiar inevitability. But things didn't follow the standard Sky script. Teammate Sergio Henao found himself rapidly distanced, Chris Froome was still well down within the group, and a number of squads with multiple riders remained in play. EF Drapak's Mike Woods found himself lured into an attack moments later and had a pretty easy time of it at first, grinding past the break and snaring a handful of seconds, much to the delight of some of the day's more enthusiastic fans. While the endless steeps took their toll on Woods, it was still Jack Haig holding team and race leader Simon Yates to Poel's wheel, and more than once the Sky Super Domestique looked back and eased his efforts after finding that Froome wasn't there. While UAE's Fabio Aru found himself struggling and eventually gapped, the pace wasn't enough to throw reigning champ Tom Dumoulin of Sunweb off his usual strategy of turning every climb into his own personal time trial. Even at 5.7k to go as Haig cracked and Froome assumed launch position and Woods was brought back, Poels still found himself checking his efforts, and Sky would have to settle for the little victories of leading the heads of state past this snarky "where Aru Froome" sign, with the Italian champion now very much in the rear view. And as an over-eager T-Rex would discover about a kilometer later, a rough Giro thus far didn't mean that Froome wasn't still up for a fight. Even Froome's eventual attack as he ground past Poels read casually enough that the camera crew initially cut to a fading Aru, before catching Bahrain's Domenico Pozzovivo leading Yates and Astana's Miguel Angel Lopez back on terms. A second cut to Aru missed another surge that formed a more convincing gap at 4.1k to go. But even then, the gains were still rather marginal in Froomian terms, as the Skyrider slowly ticked away from the chasing trio, while Dumoulin ground his way steadily closer to them, towing Groupama FDG's Thibaut Pinot all the while. Yates, likely more concerned with his 47-second GC advantage over Dumoulin than his 3-minute 20-second cushion over Froome, went to the front of the trio and slowly began pushing the gap to Dumoulin back out, though the lead 3 selections still remained very much in sight. At 3.1k to go, Yates was confident enough to put in a dig that immediately gapped his 2 companions, at least in the relatively glacial terms offered by Monte Zoncolan's steepness. At 2.6k, Lopez distanced Pozzovivo, with Dumoulin and Pinot still stubbornly ticking along behind. Yates seemed to be closing on Froome and slowly distancing Dumoulin, but the tight physical distances and low speeds made time gaps tricky, and with any little incident potentially race-changing, fans were given very little leeway. But despite the carnage, officials still managed, in rather un-Giro fashion, to pull the motos out of the Yates-Froome gap as it closed to just 4 seconds before the first tunnel inside 1k to go, and kept it similarly clear for Lopez and a fast-closing Pozzovivo moments later. By the second tunnel, Froome's margin was just 3 seconds, and as the first 2 riders emerged into a human chain of civil protection volunteers, some of whom seemed more focused than others, a catch looked inevitable. But over the closing switchbacks, Froome once again dug in hard at a high cadence, and Yates' heavier gear selection saw him slowly fall back. As Froome ground out the last few meters for the win, his margin was 6 seconds, morale boosting, but barely a dent in Yates' overall advantage. Pozzovivo passed Lopez to roll in 23 seconds down, while Dumoulin and Pinot finished at 37 and 42 seconds respectively, letting Pozzovivo pass the Groupama rider for 3rd overall, and keeping Dumoulin's deficit to Yates at an at least theoretically closable minute 24. But with a 6-second loss to Froome, the worst of Yates' Giro so far, unseating him in the final week is definitely going to be an uphill battle. I'm Cosmo Catalano, and that's how the race was won.